This past Tuesday was the feast day of St. Francis de Sales. He's one of my favorite saints. He's the spiritual director of St. Jane Frances de Chantal, up for Randolph's patron saint. St. Francis de Sales was one of the doctors of the church. One of his great spiritual works that I find the most helpful for myself, and I think would be for you as well, is his introduction to the devout life. See, some people might think that the heights of prayer and holiness are just meant for priests or for those in religious life. But that's not the way that St. Francis de Sales saw it. He understood that holiness and the heights of prayer is for everyone, regardless of your vocation. In fact, it will happen in the midst of what God is calling you to. That's where holiness will be found. And in his book, he goes through many different things to help us in the spiritual life. And the third part of his book is all about growing in virtue. Virtues like patience, humility, meekness, obedience, chastity, courage, generosity, so many other virtues as well. And he says there that at different points in our life, we should pick one or two and to focus specifically on working and growing in that virtue. He says that each person should think about, when we're trying to decide what to grow in, about what virtues are needed the most in your state of life, your specific vocation that he's called you to. But there are some virtues, de Sales says, that should color everything that we do, every action, all that we do each day. And one of these virtues is that of humility. Humility actually fits in with our readings that we have for this weekend. It's a theme that comes across in many of them. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the earth, who have observed his law. Seek justice, seek humility, says the prophet Zephaniah in the first reading. I will leave as a remnant in your midst a people humble and lowly, who shall take refuge in the name of the Lord. The Psalm 2, the psalm response, uses the first of the Beatitudes that we hear in the gospel today. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. It's related to the virtue of humility. So I wanted to consider a little bit more what this virtue of humility is and kind of draw from some of the things that St. Francis de Sales helps us with. So what is this virtue of humility and how do we grow in it? Well, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose feast day is actually today, he gives a very good definition of humility. He says that humility means seeing ourselves as God sees us. Seeing ourselves as God sees us. Knowing that every good that we have comes from God as pure gift. So humility means being humble, being poor in spirit, means to know the truth about ourselves, to see ourselves exactly the way that God sees us. And that includes all of the gifts and strengths that we have, as well as the faults and weaknesses that we struggle with too. Knowing the truth about yourself. Seeing yourself just as God sees you. St. Augustine said in one of his letters that the way to Christ is first through humility, second through humility, third through humility. So, humility is the virtue that really works against the deadliest of the deadly sins, which is pride. Because if out of pride we think that we are greater than we actually are, if we think that we're holier than we actually are, if we don't think we have enough sins that should lead us off to the confessional, then we would never really get any better because we think we've already reached the heights of perfection. And what's worse in all of that is that the proud think they have no need for God at all because we've done it all ourselves. But in reality, every good thing, the saints say, every good thing that we've done comes from God himself as his gift. Of course, on the opposite end, we can also go wrong into thinking ourselves less than we actually are. To think that we're beyond God's help, that God couldn't possibly love me because I'm such a great sinner. I do so many terrible things. But despairing of God's love for us, of his mercy upon us, is also a manifestation of a kind of pride. I've had people tell me that, Father, you talk about how we should grow in holiness and spend time in prayer, and it's like, but all that stuff really isn't for me. Like, I'm just a regular guy, just a regular person. I can't do the things that the saints do. Well, might respond to that by asking, what makes you think that you're so special that God can't make you a saint? Right? That's what he's calling all of us to do. None of us are excluded from his ability to make us into saints. You see, humility is seeing ourselves just as we are, that the way that God sees us, not greater, not less. To see that, yes, indeed, each of us are sinners, but a sinner whom God loves. That God loves each of us just as we are, but he loves us so much that he's not going to let us stay right where we are. So, how do we grow in the practice of the virtue of humility? In fact, it's so important that we do that St. Francis de Sales actually has 4 entire chapters on growth in humility, and actually a few others that are kind of sort of related to humility as well. But it begins for him with external humility, because pride often shows itself outwardly through the things that we may say or do. He says that some people take pride in a well-trimmed beard, crisped hair, soft hands, or their ability to dance or sing. Some wish to be honored and respected by people for their learning, as if everybody ought to become their students and hold them as the masters. Some strut themselves around like peacocks, thinking that they're beautiful and believe everyone is courting them. He says, this is extremely vain, foolish, and insolent, to base their glory on such trifling and silly things. Isn't that true? So often we place so much time and energy on trifling and just silly things. I wonder what Francis de Sales would have to say about how many people use social media today, wanting everybody to see and acknowledge the things that they do, and it plays so much into that vice of pride. So, St. Francis de Sales says that if we want to know if someone is truly wise, if they're truly learned or generous or noble, are they purposely trying to draw attention to those things in their life? Are they purposely bringing them to the surface? Because the more showy they are, he says, the less genuine they actually will be. You know, it's good for us to want to work hard, to grow, and even receive recognition and honors from others as a gift for the good work we've done. We ought to really accept compliments when people give us for the good things that we do. But he says that honors become worthless if we're seeking them out or demanding them. To grow in external humility, he says, we accept the recognition when someone gives it to us, but we don't become attached to it. That the virtuous, he says, are not interested in a petty jumble of ranks, honors, and salutations, as they have so many other things to do. He says, the one who is able to procure the pearls of virtue does not burden himself with all the shells. So while we're also to watch the ways in which we might look to be proud on the outside, humility also starts first on the inside. And so to grow in humility on the outside, we have to focus on what goes on within. And de Sales tells us to do this, to think and reflect upon 2 different things. The first, he says, reflect upon your sins. And second, reflect upon the graces that God has given to you specifically and personally. He says, nothing indeed can humble us so much before the mercy of God as the multitude of his benefits. And nothing can humble us so deeply before his justice as the multitude of our misdeeds. So he's telling us that we should consider all the things that God has done for us. If we find ourselves getting too proud, what has God done for us? None of the things that I have on my own are really mine. They're all from him. And then also to consider what actually are really my own. Well, what have I done against God? My sins. He says, uses this imagery, he says, alas, the mules do not cease to be clumsy beasts, even when laden with the precious and perfumed goods of the prince. What good do we have that we have not received first from God? If we've received them from him, then why are we proud? DeSales also addresses a kind of false humility that sometimes we might get ourselves into. Sometimes we can fall back on being humble in order to get out of doing something that God is asking us to do. So, for example, let's say somebody is inviting you to, say, lead a small group for Live Lent Together coming up, right? And your response is, yeah, I don't think I'm ready for that. That's more than I can do. I'm not holy enough. I don't know enough about prayer and about leading in order to do that. And so under the disguise of humility, we try to excuse ourselves from aspiring to what God's actually calling us to participate in. But see, God desires us to grow in holiness. But DeSales says, the proud man who trusts in himself, has good reason not to undertake anything. But rather the humble man is all the more courageous the more he realizes that he's powerless. The more he esteems himself worthless, the more daring he becomes, because he puts his whole trust in God, who is pleased to exalt his almighty power in our weakness and manifest his mercy in our misery. So in other words, he's saying if we're truly humble and God calls us to do something that seems to be beyond us, with great trust in him, we will step out and do it. That's what the truly humble person does. It's the proud one who says, no, I couldn't possibly do that. Well, with God's help, we can. And that's why Paul says in our second reading today that not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish of the world, the weak, the lowly, and despised, so that no human being might boast before God. You see, when God uses any of us to do amazing things, which he can and does every day, when it happens, we know it's not me. We know it is not us who do it, but it is certainly God who does it through us. This virtue of humility, too, will also grow if we accept without complaint the moments of little humiliations that come our way throughout the day. So, for example, let's say you inadvertently make some kind of mistake and someone calls you out on it and they correct you. Well, to receive the correction with grace, even if maybe sometimes people don't correct us all that well, but to receive it. St. Therese says that the childlike are not surprised when we stumble. Or say somebody blames us for something. Maybe it's not that big of a deal, but they blame it something on us, and it's not our fault. We didn't even actually do it. And so we may be tempted to defend ourselves and to make a big deal about it because they're wrong. But instead, humility says to just accept it. Not to get in an argument over who did what, and if it's such a small matter. St. Therese again says to accept with a smile on your lips the pinpricks, the thorns, the contradictions which come to you every day from those that are near you. Finally, DeSales acknowledges that to grow in humility isn't easy. He says, I've told you many things that will appear quite hard to you when you consider them, but believe me, they will be sweeter than sugar and honey when you practice them. Humility isn't easy because it's really a practice about forgetting ourselves. And humility doesn't mean that we should think less of ourselves, but really to think about ourselves less. We'll only grow in humility through the help of God's grace. And so in those secret recesses of your prayer with the Lord, ask for his help to grow in that virtue. Two kind of resources for prayer that I want to mention that I myself have found very helpful is Psalm 131. It's a very good psalm. It speaks of humility, and also a prayer called the Litany of Humility as well. Those are two that you can go to. So as I finish this homily, I'm just going to pray Psalm 131 for us. O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor haughty my eyes. I have not gone after things too great, nor marvels beyond me. Truly I have set my soul in silence and peace. As a child has rest in his mother's arms, even so my soul. O Israel, hope in the Lord, both now and forever.